A very warm welcome. Thank you very much for the introduction. So, this is a new guideline. This is already the second edition. And I would like to talk about the history briefly. So, where are we coming from? How did it all start? Mr. Lange already talked about the development of this guideline. It's a very successful guideline. Somebody even call it the Bible for our industry. And of course, we just expanded on it and built on it. And I would now like to talk about what is new when it comes to these curtain walls. So, talking about the history, where did we start? The initiation of everything was just knowing that windows and facades are only as good as the way they're put in. So high quality windows that aren't put in properly are going to lead to characteristics that are missing. So of course they are not wind resistant, etc. And the builder's not going to say, oh no, that wasn't great. They're just going to say the window is no good. And of course, that doesn't have anything to do with a high quality window. And of course, that really made it where we said, okay, we are going to have to expand on it. We are going to have to go to construction sites and we are going to have to look how they're put in. So that was in 1991. That's when we really started with this whole mounting situation. And the basis was a training for those that were responsible of putting the windows in. If they wanted to get the quality mark, they had to participate in this training so they knew what it really means and what it really means if it's done with recognized rules of technicians. So, of course, there was a training document that came with it. It was still in paper back then. And the person who did it before me and I took over in 1991. It was a really extensive piece of paper analysis from many different construction sites and what is set, what is not set, what do we have to set, etc. Again, it was all about quality marks, quality labels, etc. So that was very, very important to us. So it was a DIN A4 folder, which wasn't good for construction sites because it was very big, very heavy. And that's why the next natural step was, okay, we're going to need something smaller that you can take to construction sites. And that's how we came up with this guideline. So the first edition is up here. That was the red one, that red little booklet up here. That was in 1994. And of course, you could say the world was still perfect back then. It was a small booklet, thin. It took you 30 minutes to read through it. And yeah, it was just all about the technology when it comes to putting windows and facades in. And this is something that was expanded upon regularly. And you can see that there were several more additions. So blue was 2000, then in 2002 we had the introduction of the new law that also had an impact on us. So that's why it was adapted as well and updated. And then we had the next edition in 2006. So it was because of this folder that we saw on page one that wasn't updated anymore, but the idea was that all the main things are going to be put in this guideline. And that's why we used a different format, and that's why it was then a little bit thicker. And another important point was the harmonization in 2006 with the rules of the different associations. So they also had different mounting guidelines and they were called TR20 to summarize everything. However, partially they were very different. And of course, that's always unfortunate if you have the same situation, but you have different rules for it. So which ones apply? So which ones do you have to consider, etc. But of course, it was harmonization that was very important. So that's why we have been identical since 2006. So both sets of rules have the same content. Another update happened in 2010 and then again in 2014. That was the gold edition, so 20 years of this guideline. And that is something that was very well perceived in the market, not only within our association, but really everywhere, everywhere where windows are being mounted. So they're very much interested in this little booklet and used it. And you can see we went back to the roots. So we tried to have this 2014 edition and have this little handyman edition basically that you can take on a construction site. So everything that comes with planning was excluded because that has to happen before, not when you're on the construction site. So this is just a smaller edition to summarize everything that is important on site. Of course, that's why in the current edition from March 2020, we stopped doing that anymore. There's only one book, which is DIN A5. It's very thick now because, of course, we also have some practical things that need to be included. So, where are any shortcomings, where are problems, and how can we implement that in our guideline to be of help and also get answers on typical questions, etc. And you can also see that in 2016 we started to also have that available in several different languages. So the first version was available in English. There were more translation Polish, Romanian, and Chinese. Currently, we're at 2020 when it comes to the window guideline. And you can see on top here for our 2014 edition, they already made the decision in the working circle that they want their own guideline for facades. Up until then, topics in regards to facades were also somewhat included, but not fully. And 2014 was really the starting point. And we just said, okay, we do want our individual guideline for that for facades. And first and foremost is going to be an edition. That's what you can see here. That's the gray edition, edition 2017. So that was the initial one. And like I said, that was just sort of an addition to everything. After 5 years' time, we actually saw the first editions. And what did we do? Well, first of all, we tried to make the guideline a bit more independent. There are some topics in there that are topics that were included in the first edition, but we referred to the window guideline for that. So there are some important topics that we now included in this individual edition, just to make sure that it is also complete in and of itself. And we also have a couple of things that we added to. We updated it, obviously, and I would also like to just give you an overview of the main points. So the first thing to know is that the list of literature is very important. So what has happened since the last edition and how does it compare? So we refer to 150 books that have something to do with facades. If we look at the current edition, we are now at 231 books that we refer to. So a lot has happened over the past 5 years. However, also because of the fact that the area of application has been extended. And because of that, the extent of this guideline has increased as well. So, of course, we expanded on it. So target group, same as for the window guideline, would be the planner, the person responsible for mounting, and then the person actually putting it in at the construction site. Of course, there's also an overview with the main focuses. So what is important for the planner, what is important for the person that's responsible for everything, and also the person that's putting the actual piece in. All right, and like I said, this is just a short overview of what has happened overall. So chapter 2 is really about general and special requirements when it comes to curtain facades and also ventilated facades. So we see that there's an expansion on the application area. So in the beginning, we definitely focused on curtain facades, and that was really it. And now, because of the addition, we now also have outside facades as well. So that would be included in the guideline and also in the individual chapters as well. That's where it's considered and described. Okay, so we also have structured and set up everything in different ways. So the visualization is different. So curtain facades, of course, ventilated facades as well, and also the impacts we have to consider because that is also very important for the whole concept of everything. So you can see where is the impact coming from. So the outside or the inside. So you can see that right here. It could be quite a few different aspects. And then we also have impacts of the rooms itself. So for example, the whole topic of temperature, humidity in rooms, specifically when it comes to facades, is very important. And then, of course, also the different piping, etc., that needs to be looked into. And of course, if we have facades that include several rooms, there are specific things that you have to consider. And of course, there could be effects that could result from that. And of course, there could be movements from the building, the height of ceilings, and then also the building piece itself. So that would be the construction of the curtain facade. There could also be climate impacts that you have to consider as well. And at the end of the day, it would also be impacts such as horizontal loads. Usually facades always have high and low. So in this case, that is also important. And the whole topic of dynamic loads. So if we look at the difference in heights, for example, that you have to bridge, then of course legally you have to show that all the functions and features are included. So of course that is also a very important topic that needs to be considered. We also tried to visualize it for our users, similarly as we did with the window guideline as well. And what we see here is really just the specific requirements based on typical factors. Typical factors would be the building location. So where is the building going to be built? And of course, closely connected to that would be the wind burden that goes with it, the wind load. And of course, that is visualized here as well. And then, of course, also the building situation overall. So how strong is the facade? And how much is it exposed to the climate? And of course, overall, the situation would be very strong. So this would be a typical situation would be the right-hand side, not as much the left-hand side. And of course, you have to put a lot less effort into it in order to really have a good connection point. Another point would then be the orientation of the facade itself. So do you have sunlight? Is it the weather side? Is it the other side? That is also to be considered. And then also the facade construction in and of itself also has an impact on everything. What kind of building material are you working with? Wood, aluminum construction or steel construction. Then also coloring is very important because we've heard today that that is something that's becoming more and more extreme. The weather situations are more extreme, more sun, more temperature. That is derived from that. Of course, that also has an impact on our construction. And of course, there are also some special things that we have to consider, especially when it comes to curtain facades, breaking in, fire, and of course also sound. Then also the next topic, how is the building going to be used at the end of the day? So would it be something that's administration, without air conditioning, with air conditioning? Is it for living purposes, etc.? It always depends. And then also, of course, summer heat protection needs to be considered when it comes to living spaces. Of course, curtain facades aren't being used as often, maybe only when it comes to staircases or special buildings. Of course, there are also special guidelines that go with this. And of course, also hospital guidelines that could come into play. They need to be considered as well. And what we see here is also vandalism, for example. So based on my experience, I have to say I have seen a paper for a school that was in Bamberg, and the whole topic of vandalism was a very, very big topic. That was the key topic, to be honest, because facades were built in and we were supposed to do a status analysis, and that was really most difficult for us. And that was the whole topic of vandalism. So everything that wasn't mounted to the wall or the floor or the ceiling was gone. So some things were just glued shut, things were stolen, etc. So that is something that has to be considered in those circumstances as well. Then the next question is, how is the facade going to be implemented into the whole building? So the connection formation. And of course, in order to be able to judge what kind of requirement profile you need for that connecting point. Then the next one would be minimum requirements. And we just try to show how we're going to get from sort of the raw material to the actual building. What are the individual steps and what needs to be considered? So it's got started with anchoring, and then we move on with the airtight level, and then, of course, also heat outside, and then also everything that needs to be included so you're in the final step. And of course, everything then needs to be safely anchored. So we do actually need an airtight construction for it to work. Also, when it comes to the connection formation, of course, it's also very important that we are not going to have any harmful heat bridges where the connector is on the outside. We definitely also need to have a very tight and proper situation. Chapter 3 is really about planning, and we have certain checklists that we have created. That is very important. So we also try to implement in a way for curtain facade construction. So this checklist, of course, has been adapted and updated in line with the guidelines that have changed as well. And we also have a point that we have included, for example, summertime, and then also Attica and sustainability. All of that has been included into the checklist for planners, all the things that need to be considered. And when it comes to planning, we also have the whole different topics that you can see here. This is a very sensitive interface. The SIL training, SIL is something that we need to do because we try to show planners that this is very, very important when it comes to all the different requirements, how you can have this connection point, specifically when you look at the requirements for having a barrier-free building. So when it comes to all of that and looking at the interface to the foot point of a barrier-free door, the most important things are compensation measures, building compensation measures, and that is something that only the planner can determine. So they need to determine, do we need these compensation matters based on the requirements for this facade construction or not? Typically, you would say it would be these little roofs right here or building elements that are in very sensitive areas. And usually there's also some way for the water to get out that needs to then be connected because the water needs to be put away and not collected. So those are the little zones that you see here in order to make it where the construction is not going to get any water on it. Of course, there's also a norm for that, and that has changed as well. It used to be DIN 18195. So there are new norm numbers that go with it as well. So we have the 18531 for balconies. We have lodge and lounges. And it's just basically about waterproofing roofs that are used, roofs that are not used. Then there's DIN 18533. That is also very relevant for us to consider. What do we need to consider here? And then also other fields of application. And like I said, they're not as relevant for us. For us, it would be DIN 18531 and 33. So these changes have also been included in this guideline and it's been updated as well. And you know the whole topic of connections in the ground, 155 millimeters or 50 milliliters in connection with the water situations as we see it here. We also have the new situation that it's been adapted to, and what is special about it when it comes to this new norm is the rule set, and everything that deviates from that is then a special case. And that means, should the planner now really do that separately or not? Yes, they need to look at to this foot point and plan it in a project specific way so it's going to work. There's no norm that goes with it. Okay, so this is a special planning situation. And chapter 4. Oh, unfortunately, I can't hear the question because there's no microphone. We'll do questions in the end. Then chapter 4. That would be sound protection, fire protection when it comes to facades. So what has happened here? Well, of course, when it comes to heat protection, it would also be the introduction of the energy law, which happened in December of 2020. Of course, that was also incorporated here. And of course, that we also refer to different norms as well. So the basis for norms has changed, and there are also some updates for updated norms. DIN 4118, so there's a new version for facade connections when it comes to heat bridges as well. And that has been considered. And then we also have different topics that are very, very important. So there are different requirements that we can see here for NF, for example, and minimum protection in bridges and how that has to be included. In our guideline, we also have different examples. So what would be the minimum heat loss, so temperature factors and things like that. And in this context, we also have worked on it. So we really have to change the norm for calculation. So the calculation procedures have been modified. And in this context, we also included new variants. So we have 200 millimeters or 100 millimeters at the foot point. So we also have additional sheet 2. So that's a reduced but applicable rule in order to have the comparison. When it comes to sound protection in terms of the norm, a lot has changed. The old norm 4109 has been changed. It changed the first time in 2016. That was the first edition of the facade guideline. It's been considered for that, but of course that has been adjusted as well. So you can see part 1, it's about minimum requirements. That is the 2018 edition, which is the current edition, and part 5, which has been added in August of 2020. This is increased requirements for sound protection. And when it comes to proof, of course, there were also some changes in part 2. So, of course, this is the follow-up edition of 2016. And also what's new would be the building catalog. That is part 35 for our building pieces, so windows, doors, and facades. So that has been expanded upon as well. And how can you actually calculate all the KPIs for sound protection? And of course, also you can find more information in this catalog under section 35. Another thing that we also added is the so-called critical connectors, so sound connectors, sound protection connectors. Why? Well, because there are different ways now. And how can you actually solve situations like this? There are some examples that go with it, as you can see here. So you just have to make the spaces as small as possible. And wherever there is a little gap, which is what you need, then of course the mass also plays a role. So we are going to actually make sure that it's airtight, that little gap, and you need some mass for that. And of course, that also has an impact on sound. We also have something that is new from the IFT research project. Those are the tables that I talked about earlier. So those would partition wall connections, and of course, those come with different rules. You can actually see the different element facades, curtain facades, and of course, that's great orientation. And the same also holds true for different connectors. We have sound longitudinal lines. Of course, that is also something that is being calculated here, the different connectors and what is needed. And then, of course, also for element facades to summarize. Another thing that's been added is the whole topic of panels. Of course, that is also important. There are some tables for it, but of course you can't get very far with this opaque infill because it's very much simplified. And of course, it's very much limited in terms of the statements you see here. But again, we have conducted a research project on the part of IFT with some calculations, and you can really see how you can soundproof these panel constructions. And you can calculate ahead of time how to do that. And that has been included in the guideline. Fire protection, like I said, that's been expanded as well. So we have ventilated facades. And again, we have a very important topic right here because when it comes to fire protection facades, you can see that they can actually have the ventilated space. How can you avoid for it to catch more fire? Of course, there are some requirements in terms of building. So that's the horizontal and vertical fire bridges for ventilated facades. And again, we have some pictures that go with it and also what it could look like and how it can be implemented, these fire barriers. Capital 5 would be statistical systems and anchor points. So again, it's been expanded on the ventilated facades. So what do we have here? Typically in terms of static systems that are being implemented, and usually those would be hanging frames that you see here, either with joints or with this little corner. And that is sort of the connection of the lower construction being the anchoring point or also being a loose point because it's the same principle overall as we just saw with curtain facades. And that way you can just avoid problems. Of course, we've also included corrosion protection. So it really describes what kind of relevant corrosion there could be, contact corrosion, for example, etc. Tension corrosion, gap corrosion, and all of these different points are included here. That's a very important topic, especially when it comes to different elements, etc. And of course, that can be a big topic. Or the filiform corrosion, if you actually have an aggressive atmosphere, it could be when you're close to the ocean, coastal area, or close to the coast. You can say up to 30 kilometers inland. And we also have specifically developed some suggestions and guidelines what kind of corrosion resistance classes are required depending on the location. And derived from that, we also have the material quality that needs to be used. Overall, we can say that we also have galvanic steel that can be used for inside purposes, and outside it would be steel that should be used, high quality steel, sometimes also special legions when it comes to very aggressive environments that you have to consider. Talking about contact corrosion, this is a new guideline. How can you avoid it and what kind of situations work, what doesn't work, what should be avoided in order to avoid contact corrosion. So this picture right here, this is our bike holder that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with contact corrosion, but it shows very well what happens here. So we have a wood construction right here. We also have the little stand, which is a steel construction that everything sits on and everything has been out in weather conditions for several years. And this construction still looks like it's new because it works very, very well the way it is. And then right next to it, it's exactly the same construction. The only difference being that there's a stainless steel sheet that's being used. And of course, there's no protection to it. So for users, you can see that the rainwater just collects there and then use this indirect contact corrosion, which is quite massive. And that is just because of this unfortunate pairing. All right. So chapter 6 is also very important. Over the past 5 years, not a lot has changed when it comes to waterproofing in general. So we have the different levels that we looked into, and that would be the three levels that we have in our definition. You know this model. So we have the airproof level, as you see here. And then on the outside, we have our waterproof level. And where does that have to be when it comes to facades and outside walls and connectors? Of course, there are also connections with different elements. And then also in this function area. And the second topic we added would be the resistance, water steam resistance. So you know this principle as well. So this would really be what you see here. And of course, we have just looked at the different systems and where are they at in terms of the values. And we added to it in order to really have these SD values and really differentiate regular building materials from that. And you can also see that when it comes to gap sealing tape. So of course there are multi-function bands as well, but overall I would say that that's not the biggest topic when it comes to curtain facades. And it's just not as relevant for this topic. Then chapter 7 is about the practical aspects. So really what has changed practically. Like I said, we tried to make the guideline a little bit more independent. And for that reason, we now have these neutral data sheets for the different systems that you typically have when it comes to curtain facades, foils, different materials, tapes, for example. So we have this neutral sets of technical data that we took on. And for construction workers on site, this is sort of summarized what they already need to know. So what can this seal system do? What's the seal system like and proofing system like? And there are some examples that go with it. And overall, we have to say that everything is on site and everything is summarized very shortly and briefly. And again, we have the whole topic of floor connectors of elements with the respective examples for the practical execution. So what does that mean in terms of requirements? Everything is covered. So they actually have to connect to the foot point of our facade, and it's very important. You building facades, you are not going to proof it. That is not your job. That is actually somebody else's job. They need to connect it to your facade, and you also only need to create the foot point in a way that they can properly do that. And of course, we tried to do that as well. We tried to include some drawings and give some indication as to how to do that and how you do that step by step, what should it look like. So you can see the different performance of the different sheets that can be used. And of course, proofing can also then be done properly, and the connection can then be attached to the foot point. And this is actually the airtight closure of the facade construction, just as an example. And then the implementation, of course, there are also some guidelines based on the norm. What does that mean for the facade points? First of all, there are some rule cases that we looked at earlier, so that would be 1 and 2, and they just try to be explained here by way of some pictures that describe everything. So that would be the 15 centimeter height. So again, these are the requirements, 15 centimeters above the top layer. So how can you actually execute that properly? If you have the facade foot point set properly on the right-hand side, you can actually see it with a water pipe of the drainage channel. And again, we can see some special planning situations, and we already discussed that earlier as well. That would be the whole topic of the house or building being barrier-free. So again, these are with barrier-free thresholds. As you can see, those are examples as well. And what's very important is that this is a very sensitive point when it comes to it being proof. So of course, there are some compensation measures that have to be taken, and that could be a drainage channel or other additional measures that could be required. And specifically when it comes to this picture, you can also see some regulation in terms of sort of porches or canopies because they need to be connected properly. And we saw earlier that we actually see the facade right here with air. Of course, that's not helpful at all or not much because you are protected from wind. But of course, there's no point for the water that is just going down the facade in the front. It's just going to go down the building and then on the bottom. So once there's wind, it's going to be in there. And then there's a drainage channel right here that is going to be pushed against the building. So it's then going to be moved away from the building. So there's going to be less of a burden on the building, which is also very important. And of course, when it comes to a porch, it shouldn't only be to the front, but also to the left and the right of the door to also make sure that you sort of have this little angle right here. And as an alternative, it could also be just something that is going to keep away wind. Another chapter that was included is what you see here, that is chapter 7.12. And when you need approval, it's the whole topic of, and we're just going to think of visual fault. What are we going to do with that? Well, if we don't try to give you a guideline to tell you what is good and what is bad. Unfortunately, that's not going to work like that, but at least we tried to just show you what kind of shortcomings they could be and what kind of support you could get in order to deal with these and judge these irregularities, if you want to call them that. So it's always, okay, what is it all about? And also, where can you find solutions for the problem? Now, to wrap up the whole topic of chapter 8, which was also expanded upon a lot, and in the beginning was just a very small change, but now with the new edition, it was actually a big focus area of us. You can also see it because of the way we set it up now. We have a lot of different connector points and examples that are included right here. It could be different types of construction. It could be different types of facades. It could be pure aluminum for element facades, and also Lichter constructions are also part of it with these connectors, top, bottom, left, right, different levels of a building just as an orientation and as an example of how something like that could be executed. This is also just an overview of everything, so we show you a setup right here, so it's not just a simple description of it, but it's really just planning details by way of pictures, as you can see, with some indications as to what is important or what needs to be considered. And like I said, all of that is just supposed to give you some orientation. Not everything that looks different is not allowed. Those are just examples. So again, there are always several different options that are feasible. So that was everything I wanted to say. And like I said, that was just a brief overview of what has changed. Thank you very much to everybody who contributed to editing this guideline. You could see apart from IFT was also lots of different bodies, VFF and UBF, which is the independent consultancy agency for facades. And of course, now I would like to say good luck for everybody that's working with it. Thank you.